Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I realize some of your mouths may be full and you're getting some food and things like that. I'm overjoyed to see you all here today for our program, a continuation of our Power Diversity Lecture Series. For those of you I have not met or I don't know, I'm Robert Solomon, and I serve as Vice President for the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement. And so I'm thrilled to welcome each of you to our moderated discussion today on Engaged Citizen American Freedom. We're excited that in our programs this year, and we started this last year, that we have co-sponsors from many of our student organizations that are part of what we do. Our co-sponsors today are BSU, Alianza, and the Brotherhood. Certainly great and dynamic student organizations on our campus. We're so happy to be able to work with them and to partner in the work that we do. Today's moderated panel of scholars aim to hold conversation rooted in navigating the intersections of identity, one's perceptions, lived experiences, and impacts on community. So in times of uncertainty, and we surely know we're living in those times right now, one of the most powerful ways we can connect with one another is through meaningful dialogue and community. So by coming together and sharing stories, actively listening to one another, we can create spaces for understanding and empathy and growth. Dialogue allows us to challenge our assumptions, to broaden our understanding, and uncover a common thread that could bind us past any differences that we might experience. And so we're happy to have this discussion. Certainly, we are still celebrating Black History Month. And as we get into it, I won't talk too much about the details of it. As we get into it, you'll see how there's a connection there, and that it's even a broader connection in terms of the discussions that we have. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Heather Burton. She's a graduate of The Ohio State University, OHIO, with a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Black Studies with a minor in theater, a Master's of Social Work from the University of Akron, a Master's in Public Policy Administration, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Urban Studies and Public Affairs from Cleveland State University. She's a candidate for another doctorate, which she just seems to do these things in her spare time. Dr. Burton serves as Associate Vice President and Senior Director for Faculty and Institutional Diversity here at Case Western in our Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement. And she works to create and encourage individual and systemic change through policy and practice. Dr. Burton serves also as an adjunct professor in Africana Studies, theater, social work, teaching on concepts of race, racism, and policy, social policy. Some of her published works include My Eloquent, Angry Black Rage, a book chapter in Teaching Beautiful, Brilliant Black Girls, Crimson Heights, I'm Single, So What, and upcoming releases, Where Are the Women? A Guide to Intergenerational Women's Ministries and Student Success in Historically Black Spaces. How HBCUs, Black churches, and the Divine Nine demonstrate the benefits of separatism in higher education. And on and on. But she will introduce our illustrious panel this morning. And most of you know them. I don't know if you know Maria Stutzman y Marquez from the Weatherhead School of Management. We have David Miller from the Mandel School of Applied and Social Sciences. And we have Joy Bostic from the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm sure their academic areas and the work that they do might be elucidated on by Dr. Burton at some point. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Burton. Let's welcome our panel.
So good afternoon, everyone. We are engaged citizens today, so I need you to be a little louder. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, much better. So when we talk about engaged citizens and American freedom, I'm excited to be with this panelist this afternoon and have this conversation. And one of the things that you will notice is that when the PowerPoint gets to working, you will see their bios behind you, because we don't want to use the time to read bios because these are three very accomplished individuals. And so you're probably going to hear part of their bios and stories throughout. But we really want to talk about what does it mean to be an engaged citizen, and what does that look like when we're dealing in American freedom? And so kind of to begin, what I want to ask you all is, I want you to think about this. So here's our title, this title of Engaged Citizen and American Freedom. And so when we think about that, we often don't think about what it means to be an engaged citizen and how it relates to our social identities. And so what I want you to answer first, for example, my social identities are that of a Christian Black woman. And everything that I do is shaped in those three identities. And even when we talk about me being engaged within the community, the work environment, my sorority, everything revolves around those three identities. And so in that, what I want to ask you is, first, what are your identities? How do you identify? And then two, how do you think that impacts you as an engaged citizen? And so we'll start with Joy. We're going to go in alphabetical order just because that's the way the bios are right now. And we want to give people the opportunity to read your bio behind you.
Good afternoon. So happy to be here. So I want to add to my bio in terms of my social identity. I am the great-great-granddaughter of Emma Anderson, and I am the daughter of James Earl Bostic Jr. and Betty Catherine Bostic. Those are just important things for me to say in the space as we talk about sort of our identity. So I identify as a Black African-American woman. I'm a woman of faith. I call upon my Christian background and identity, and I honor my ancestors who've been making a way for me. And so we'll talk more about double consciousness in terms of the pressures to conform to certain systems, et cetera. I'm always called to listen to and rely upon the spirit and my ancestors as a marker and as a way of understanding my pathway. Is that all we're saying right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, Miller.
Me, okay. Just want to make sure.
You're in the right order too. This is great.
And we did it by, without any help.
Right.
I'm glad everyone is here, and I am very appreciative to be here. My name is David Miller. I am from North Carolina. My identity is part Southerner, Black male. I grew up in a household. My grandparents raised me. My mother lived about 2 blocks away, but my social parents were my grandparents. It took me a while to say this, so I'll say it again. I'll say it now. Grew up as a single. My mother was a single mother. So in many cases, I sit before you and others as somebody who should not be here, because if you look at the statistics, Black men who come from single parents usually end up in places better known as cemeteries, prisons, or on some street corners. Not to make a generalization, but that is a statistic that many of us know, and that is something I always think about and carry with me when I go, because when I walk in the door, you see a Black man. And as an experience I've had on this campus, just because I have dreadlocks, that puts me in another category. Particularly with law enforcement individuals. And so this is an opportunity to talk about this dual consciousness that we carry around with us on each and every day.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Statsmani Marquez, and it is really an honor and a privilege to be amongst all of you today, and thank you for being here. I'm a proud New Mexican. I grew up in northern New Mexico in a small town called Taos. Taos is known for its kind of tricultural piece of it. We have the Taos Pueblo, who have been there for thousands of years. They've been stewarding the lands and the waterways for generations, long before the Spaniards came, and long before other folks came to the U.S. So it's really important for me to say that as somebody who grew up there, and recognizing the Taos people as a part of who I am because of them. I identify as Chicana, which means that I am part Mexican, part American, but there's more to that. It was a politicized term in the 1970s. So both my parents met in college during the Chicano movement, and so my mom was there learning bilingual education, and my dad is a veteran, Vietnam, served twice, and basically as a white man came back to the U.S. and was done with the U.S. And so he really took on a role of appropriation, a bit of culture. He felt like that was who he was going to be and who he was going to be proud to stand for. And so, I am the legacy of both my parents and also my grandparents. And I love that we're talking about our families here, because I always think about, standing on the shoulders of giants, and thinking about, Maya Angelou said something once that, you bring with you all the people who have ever been kind to you. And so I was thinking about that on my way in today, and how can you bring in that factor? What I do want to say about my grandparents is that they were also social workers, and really much into making sure that their communities are strong and cared for. I identify as a Catholic person, largely Christian, and I think about the Catholic social teachings and social justice aspect of that group, because we know the history there. And so my grandmother, Guadalupe Romero Trujillo, she is somebody who became an educator early. She was one of the first in New Mexico to become a teacher, and because of her, I would not be here, and continuing to create opportunities and access for others like myself and my family. So there you go.
Thank you all, and thank you for being transparent and sharing your stories and sharing your identities. And I wanted to set the premise so that this kind of helps us with the conversation. And as we think about it, because the audience probably does not know, and we don't want to make any assumptions about what your identities are, and so for you to clarify with the audience. And so W.E.B. Du Bois states, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, or measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dog strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." And so when we think about this political climate, when we think about being an engaged citizen and this concept of American freedom, the question becomes, and in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, how do we navigate these two worlds when we have multiple social identities? And although W.E.B. Du Bois was focusing on race and focusing on being a Negro and being an American, we can look at W consciousness a little further now and thinking about the marginalization of identities, or marginalized identities, identities that have suffered from oppression. And so when we think about this, how do we become these engaged citizens when we are warring? Do I really support this American freedom? Am I a part of this American freedom? And so in that, do you think that the concept of double consciousness still holds today?
I will, from my perspective here, it's important that we engage. As somebody who has overseen admissions at business schools, and I'm going back to my scope of reality, is I'm finally at a place in my life where I get to help and support and be kind of a decision maker. And I look at the ways and the worlds in which I've had an opportunity to walk in, and because of my passingness, I'm able to make, inroads in places for people and others that have not been there before. And so I think there's always that walking of a fine line, and being a part of many worlds. And I think that is never not on my mind in any social situation. And I don't know, and just to be fully transparent, I'm at a business school. You look at the levels of leadership at the highest levels and you don't see representation. And so, are we perpetuating an institution that is not working? I think about this daily, and I think about like, how do business schools have to change? How do education centers have to change in order to recreate and expand and evolve? So that's what I'll say for now.
Thank you. Of course, I believe it exists. When I leave this building and I get in my car and I head home east, I live in Lake County. I like to say I live behind enemy lines. And for me, I say that jokingly, but I also know what the history of that area is. And as a Black man, I am constantly aware of when I am outside this institution and I'm inside this institution, things can happen here just because someone sees me and they see my skin color and my gender first. This dual consciousness is something that we constantly have to grapple with in a society and in a country that right now is saying if we don't talk about the history, it doesn't exist. If we don't address, if we cut money from this program or that institution, the problem will go away. As a social worker, we understand and we see the impact of systemic racism, systemic sexism, systemic fill in the blank on individuals each and every day. Whether your consciousness is, I'm straight American and I'm like this and we should always go with the flag. Well, when I see the flag, I've seen that flag used to abuse Black people, American Indians, Hispanics, to quote unquote protect white womanhood. Yet this flag is flown around, and if you don't have one on your car or your house, sometimes you're unpatriotic. Or if you challenge that flag, you are somehow un-American. A part of my identity also is a military background. And one of the things we learned very early in the military, if you are in distress, the flag goes upside down. But we know this country is in distress, but I don't see any flags upside down. So that double consciousness has to be bold if we are really going to be engaged. And we have to step out, because if things continue down this trek, worked in a prison also. And let me just say this, as Richard Pryor said, go to prison and you see just us. But if you remember the line after, he said, I'm glad there are prisons. Because there are some people, as a social worker, may not go with the dogma, there are some people that don't play good in the sandbox. But South Carolina had a death row. The governor signed a death warrant for someone who was going to be executed. And I've been saying this, and it may not be politically correct, which I don't care about. The last election led to the signing of a death warrant for many people in this country. It is coming out with the health care, the environment, the protections that we have all enjoyed, that double consciousness. We're Americans, we've got these civil rights. Where are those civil rights today?
I mean, the question actually turns on another statement that Du Bois makes. What does it feel like to be a problem? Because fundamentally, these cycles are always about white folks who want to maintain privilege, trying to address what does it mean for marginalized folks who are problems. And so I've dealt with that as a woman coming into ministry. I remember going to the bookstore. I was at Ohio State at that point in time, and I was dealing with a call in the ministry. And I went to a bookstore, and there were, in the center, there were all these books on the woman question. What do you do with women in preaching? And it hit me, Du Bois' question. I was like, this is the same question. Yeah. What they're saying as a woman, what does it feel like to be a problem? And I never had a debate with anyone about being called to ministry because I knew I was called. But what it helped me to understand across a number of social identities is the way in which people who wanted to exclude would create sort of this notion of you as a problem. And so this double consciousness or triple consciousness, or however it lays out for you, is about navigating internally as well as how you engage being someone who's considered a problem. And so Du Bois's quote that Dr. Burton read at the beginning, the warring souls, speak to that internal conflict. And so this is a sort of a double sort of concern is who the people who are actually struggling inward because they're hearing the tapes and the messages, et cetera, that are playing in their mind, but also what does it mean to be engaged and to actually be the target or to have to absorb people who consider you a problem when you stand up and you speak the truth, when you confront, when you speak truth to power. So those are the pieces that we're always sort of navigating. And just going back to my family story, my father was one of the first, if not the first, Black foremen for International Harvard. We're from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And my grandfather actually was a janitor and got my father on at International Harvard as a janitor, and then he moved up. My father was brilliant, so he actually ended up being one of their first one of their first programs for bringing in Black engineers. And so and there were two white engineers who actually mentored him in secret because they would have received backlash for working with Black folks to integrate International Harvester. And I say that because I watched my parents, who were always clear with me about identity and politics, but they had to navigate because they had a family to raise. They had a family to support. And so they created space for me where I've always been my own person, but I've also had to navigate these messages. And so this whole notion of double consciousness and how we move in and out of spaces are both about how these systems impact us and demand conformity, but also how our very own family members and elders and people in our community who are concerned about our safety and have a desire for us to live and thrive are also giving us messages. This is what's so powerful about the Super Bowl halftime. And I know there's all kind of, arguments around that. But what was powerful about that in this moment, at this time, and the role of art in terms of engagement is the way in which Samuel L. Jackson's character played Uncle Sam as both representing the system that demands conformity, but also the elders in community. They're saying, look, you got to know how to play the game. Tighten up. You got to know how to play the game. But what was powerful about Kendrick Lamar, whatever you want to think about it, is for me, what was most impactful was seeing the images of people celebrating at home, particularly Black folk, who the audacity of him coming to the Super Bowl and performing what we call blackity black, culture in that space, and the American flag being represented by bent Black bodies, speaks to the power of art to actually be able to push back and say, no, this is America too. And in fact, what he's saying with the flag is this was built on all of this. And so to see people celebrating helps me to speak to part of what we need is engaged citizenship, how we can stand and maintain our sense of consistency in working and battling, particularly because at this point in time, even though the laws have not changed, we're seeing institutions and companies voluntarily conform out of fear, and how quickly we're being thrown under the bus, right? And so what we understand is people who we thought were allies, the kinds of ways in which people talked about moral vision, et cetera, all of that is up for grabs now. And so how do we stay placed? But one of those things in terms of psychically is art. I was telling someone in January, I didn't sleep. First 2 weeks I had COVID, and the second half was after the inauguration. I went to a program on Anansi the Spider, which is an African, I should say, myth and storytelling. And then I went to see Alvin Ailey that night. And usually on Saturday, I'm an introvert. I need to be by myself to restore. And I came home from all of that and slept so well because I was engaged in being nurtured by the very thing that is a part of who I am and my identity. And I could feel from the people who were in the room that we were all struggling in the same way. And so being nurtured by the very art forms and the culture and the literature and the things that actually have nurtured and sustained us, that gives us recipes for how to keep moving forward, is very important. And that's why that Super Bowl performance was so critical for people in their homes, regardless of how other people are interpreting it, because they need to see that kind of presence, that kind of audacity, that kind of courage, that kind of authenticity in that moment in which oftentimes we're excluded, oftentimes, we're programmed. Joe Budden doesn't say a lot that I agree with, but he said, because he first of all really rejected Kendrick Lamar's set list because he should have played his hits. And then he said in another couple of days, we've been programmed to have a certain expectation of a Super Bowl performance. And Kendrick Lamar did not conform to that. And that's what these systems are. We're programmed to conform to particular kinds of expectations. And we've talked about this, about hair, about style, all these kinds of things.
Joy, I'm gonna wrap you up for a minute.
I know.
Yep, I'm gonna wrap you up so we can move to some other stuff because you're giving
I know
me
I'm
many
saying
questions.
everything.
Yep.
Okay. But saying all that to say is that double consciousness particularly continues to exist, and how we navigate that is also a question of what kinds of rituals of renewal do we actually engage in.
Thank you. Great answers. And I think as I'm listening to you, you gave me so many other questions that I wanted to ask, and it's so loaded. But as you talk about the Super Bowl, one of the things that I thought about, I was listening to a podcast, and there was someone that came on the podcast, and it was a Black person. And they were talking about Kendrick Lamar and saying, Kendrick Lamar, this is the reason that the Super Bowl's performance was horrible and it sucked because Kendrick Lamar was not mainstream. We know what mainstream means. It wasn't white. Kendrick Lamar did not perform. And then he said, and the white people that I was with did not get the performance. And my thing became, it has to be miserable to live your life around the opinions of white America based on what you see. Because as you said, when Black people watched the Super Bowl, we was like, oh, this is blackity, blackity, black, black, black. And it was a message that was given. And so if you knew, you saw the message resonating. But when we think about comments like, my white friends didn't get it, the people that are around me that are white didn't get this, and to think that I have to live my life based on whiteness, and I have to live my life, and people don't want to accept that that's a real thing, but I have to live my life based on whiteness. I have to live my life based on white culture and the opinion of white America. Let's back up for a minute and let's break down, what does it mean to be American?
Oh boy.
Told you that those aren't questions on the script. This is what happens when you got a journalism background. You go off script.
To be an American, for me, is to speak out against injustice when you see it. Joy and I were talking about the Super Bowl halftime, and folks are just spending a lot of time around that, which is great. I had to call my son. I was like, well, what was he saying, David? So I could figure out what's going on. And then I started reading about it. I said, okay, I get it. But then there's something Malcolm said about distractions. And I said, wait a minute. We're talking about Kendrick Lamar over here, which we should. But all this other stuff is going on over here. People are losing benefits. Rights are being taken away from them. Things are just, allies are being pushed out. Lies are being told. But we're over here talking about this. Being an American means let's call out what we see. I agree so much with what you said, Joy, about art. Marvin Gaye, What's Going On? When I listen to that, when that comes out today, that is still relevant. that was going on for the young folks in here. That song came out during the Vietnam War. That music is still relevant today. Being an American is making that connection across the way. Gil Scott-Heron, everyone heard Kendrick say, the revolution will be televised, right guy, wrong time, or something. Mm-hmm. But if you listen to that word, that's great. But he has a song called Winter in America. I challenge each and every one of you, go out and listen to that, because right now, you think it's cold in Cleveland right now? Listen to Winter in America and listen to the words that he is saying and the message that is behind that. And then a couple of weeks ago, VP Solomon read Donny Hathaway's, The World, and it is, I cannot remember what's the name of the song? Yeah, we're having these senior moments these days. But basically, the spinning off its axis. Being in America, this version of America for David Bernard Miller is not the America that I signed on for. If something is wrong, and being an American is being able to say something is wrong, it's not right, it has to be challenged. That, for me, is what being that American is. I see you moving, so here.
Oh, no, I was just scratching, sorry. My arm was itching, sorry.
I feel like there was a mic drop happening. So.
Yeah, no, I want to talk more about what does it mean to be an American, especially if we're thinking about this whole concept of American freedom and being an engaged citizen and double consciousness, is that we look today and what we may identify as what it means to be American. W.E.B. Du Bois was dealing with other things in terms of what it meant to be an American. But then on the flip side, he was dealing with the same stuff that we're dealing with right now. So W.E.B. Du Bois was still saying, how do I navigate these two worlds? How do I integrate within a culture without losing my identity? Or do I have to assimilate while we've got others saying, no, let's create separatism. Let's go our own way. Wakanda forever. And thinking about this. So when we really look at this, because often we don't think about what does it mean to be an American? And we talked about the flag. And for many marginalized communities, the flag does not have the same symbolization that it has for other Americans. And so I really want to hone in on what does it mean to be this American?
The loadedness in the question is, I'm gonna say this from a perspective of growing up in New Mexico and having my family having been from that area for over 600 years. I don't know, and I think my mom would say this, I've heard her say it, we don't know if we have been American. We know that we are, from a logical perspective, that the land is America now. We hope New Mexico does not become changed name. So it's, and I, like a personal experience, when I moved from New Mexico for the first time, and I moved out to the East Coast, and I came back for that first winter, and I remember my family, most, like all of us, know Spanish, but also English speaking. They all said, did you learn English? Like, what happened? And it was just in those small moments of understanding that I went to a new place and learned a new language. And when we think about New Mexico as being kind of like the Wild West, it's a little bit, it's deeper than that, right? We still have 23 Pueblo and indigenous peoples on the land who do not subscribe to the U.S. governmental. And when we think about voting and participating in the U.S. elections and all that, many people don't, because it's not, it's not a part of their system. And so, but I look at leaders like Deb Haaland now, who's running, and the more representation that we have from our indigenous brothers and sisters, that is all taking place. But that feeling of being a part of America is still very divided. And it's divided now more than ever, but when the borders cross you, right, and there's an impact there. I would also say that I'm coming from a place where there are also people who are Latino who are coming from maybe first generation, or or they are the first, to be here generally. And I think about like, what does America mean from that perspective? And I can't speak for everyone, but even for myself, it's like the hopes and the dreams of being able to kind of create more impact and have more legacy and be like the ancestors, down the road for others that are coming through. Like that's the hope. And when those dreams and that feeling is diminished and abolished because they want us distracted, they want us enraged, and to know that the continued efforts and the work are going to take some continuous resilience and maintaining of those values and the spirit that we have from the generations and the legacies who have come before us. But that's.
Thank you. And I just want to continue with what you're saying. I mean, that coming from sort of Africana worldview, the notion of freedom and community, the notion of freedom has both an individual and a communal aspect. And part of the problem with the ways in which this word is being circulated through the mainstream in certain segments of white America, it's really the freedom to monopolize and impose one's view upon others. And that becomes a whole problem of not being engaged with others to actually learn. I mean, the whole thing about the Super Bowl, I don't understand it. Therefore, it must be wiped off the face of the earth, rather than like, what does it mean to be engaged and actually understand that? But that it's not just about the ancestral piece, is that we're working toward a future for those who will come after us. And so we're always navigating what's come before us, the recipes and the rituals that we already bring with us as a part of our worldview, and the freedom to actually be able to engage and live and express that. I mean, that's what we're talking about in terms of art, in terms of how we lead, et cetera, et cetera. But also it's always about, we're always thinking about who's coming after us and what does it mean to be able to engage that. And part of the problem is, and we sort of talk about this American system, is that oftentimes people are thinking about it in a zero-sum game. And so then it always becomes like, who gets sacrificed, who gets thrown under the bus? Whereas from my standpoint, my family, it's like, that's a very strange, and especially from a religious standpoint, but it really is about how are we bringing everyone together. And so those notions of justice, how are we treating one another, and not just justice, but love. Love and justice are always come together. And how do you navigate that? And so freedom and being American, which my family has always claimed because we know the contributions that we make, and they've always emphasized education, et cetera, is always about the communal responsibility to engage our lives and one another in a way that we're always contributing to not only our own expression, but to the ability of all of us to sit at the table together, for all of us to eat, for all of us to be well, for all of us to thrive. And so that is the warring of those two things when we come into institutions that have zero-sum game or want us to compete with one another in a way that, means an over and againstness. It becomes difficult. It can become difficult for people to figure out how to navigate that. And particularly, we can talk about this in terms of administrative leadership as well as other kinds of pieces. So.
Yeah, and I as you were talking about the gain and the loss and the sum, it makes me think of Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us. And I know in our office, one of the things that we always say is that when we're talking about this work, we're talking about it from a lens of being a both and versus an either or, coined by VP Robert Solomon in our office. But in that, one of the things that you, Joy, and Maria, you talked about was bringing people along. And we know that W.E. Du Bois had this concept of the talented 10th, and what that looked like. And so if we look in the room and we look up here, we would be a part of the 10th. And so in that, when we think about even his concept of double consciousness, the talented 10th, how do we, especially today, bring others along when we're talking about just the pushback and the fight of being an individual within this society, is that we're navigating, we're fighting, we're pushing every day. And so how do we engage in those concepts to actually bring others along?
I mean, I think the first thing we always recognize, not in the sense that, we're limited by it, but that we're all examples of what's possible. So I was always aware growing up of what it meant to see people exercising freedom. I mean, I remember my aunt, who one of my mother's younger sister, who's only 10 years apart from me. But when I was growing up, and she was in college, and she would bring me to visit at Ball State, and she wore her hair short and natural, and all these kinds of things taught me early on like what is possible. And I think that's what art and artists do, is they teach us, or they show us, they demonstrate like what's possible, and the power and the audacity of being able to stand, in one's power. I don't know why I was thinking about Public Enemy, Too Black, Too Strong, but it was about the ways in which we fear people who really stand very much in their power. And so, in part, we not only open doors for people by the work that we do, and again, I think that's what we're always navigating as administrators. We're always trying to find ways to open up the institution, make it more flexible, make it more open, and to create spaces for people to come in, not only for those individuals, but because we know it makes the institution stronger. We know it makes the community stronger when we have, sort of greater diversity and people from different perspectives. So I think we stand in a place, in a way, where the work that we do, it opens doors and affects and impacts others, but also helps to create a community that is open, that is more fair. When we're not silent in these rooms, when we speak up, when we confront faculty and administrators who need to learn more or be different in community.
I believe one of the things, an initiative that, again, came out of your office, VP Solomon and Dr. Burton, around mentorship. Being able to reach out and reach back to the young folks, the old folks, the folks in your cohort, to say, look, let's work on this together. There's enough of this to go around for all of us. I mean, what affects me will also affect you. I heard Dick Gregory say one time, it's really hard to advance when you've got your foot on someone else's neck. You can only stretch as far as your inseam will allow you to go. So if we can move beyond that sort of mentality with our efforts, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the administration area, whether it's in the C-suite, whether it's in our community by being involved in various activities, whether it's political, economic, religious, social. If it's doing nothing but going into a school that's under-resourced, and you know it's under-resourced, and saying, hey, I'm going to teach you kids how to play chess. I'm not going to teach you how to play checkers. I'm going to teach you how to play chess. I'm going to show you games that will build your cognitive abilities, reaching out, taking time away from those distractions, whether it be TikTok, Instagram. My favorite one is Reddit now. And so moving away from those distractions and putting efforts into the community. You've mentioned a couple times, again, art, and I was taking down some notes here. Du Bois talked about the strength that is inherent in Black folk to hold it together in this double and triple and quadruple consciousness. That is so important, to exhibit that strength in times such as this. Also, there's Percival Everett. When he was here a couple of years ago, his book, The Trees, highly recommended. He talked about, he has a line and I can't remember, but in essence it says issues that pertain to Black folks, and you can say marginalized folks, vulnerable folks, racialized folks, has a shelf life, a short shelf life. And we see that with the Targets, the Walmarts, because, oh, now you woke. Whatever that means, you acknowledge that something happened in the world. We need to address it. We got to retreat from it. So it has a shelf life. We must remove that weight in our society. if we're going to move forward, that slavery, Jim Crow, issues that the Trail of Tears. I do research on osteoarthritis around knee pain. Yeah, social worker, real interesting. One of the things that stands out to me, yes, black folks get it more. Yes, black women get it. But a line I read that American Indians have the worst health care in the United States. We don't talk about that. It says, keep it out of sight, keep it out of mind. We need to talk about that. If we want to advance, we need to talk about it, and we need to be bold with it. We cannot be timid. The time for timidness is over, because you see being quiet, what it has gotten us. As I said earlier, a death warrant. I'm a public health person also. If you read the history of public health, you go back, infectious diseases at the turn of the 20th century, wiping out thousands or causing disabilities. And we're going to head to that. Influenza before COVID, influenza and malaria frequently fought each other to lead the world in death. Now we're talking about having someone who believes that horse tranquilizer is a possible cure for certain conditions. Flu season right now has spiked. We can continue to talk about things. We can continue to be distracted, but we have work to do, and we have to work together. That's just what happens in my community. What used to be, if white America sneezes, black America gets pneumonia or something like that. Well, right now, all of us are going to have pneumonia, double pneumonia, as they used to say back in my neighborhood. So we must stand up and lead and help and say, I've got to do something.
I want to take that on too, from a public health perspective, because I think about the way to resist is by going to some of the more simple ways, right? So not subscribing to pharma, not subscribing to the food industry in many ways, and finding ways to get good quality food. But we know about the food deserts, right? So we know about the disparities there. So it's how can we as individuals kind of craft our life? The world wants us stressed, and we think about what stress does. I'm just riffing on this because I'm with you on this on public health, but I think about cardiac, diabetes, strokes. Those are all happening. Stress and food. And that is pervasive across where we don't have access, right, to all the best quality of foods in different places. And so I think about that as one disparity. And I think to your question about how do we help, how do we continue to engage, and how do we bring people with us? I think it's about sharing practices, right, on an individual and on a collective basis. But then there's also this when you originally asked the question, I kept on thinking I was 35 years old before I was working with somebody who was a manager or supervisor who was also Latina. And so I had this experience up to then. And you know what? She schooled me. For my first day at work, she took me at a university all the way up to the provost and the president's office and said, I want you to meet this person. And she took me around the entire campus. She brought me more into community that I was from the community. She brought me more in. And she brought me to different groups and, just different events that were ongoing. And I did not know that was a way of being outside of what my family does and how my family's inclusive in those ways. But I had never experienced that. So I think about the responsibility that I have to the people that I work with, regardless of who we are and how we show up, and how can I bring that along. But I do think it's about sharing the messages where, on an individual and a collective message on how we can actually help to change and fight against and resist some of the issues that are pervasive in our communities.
Mm-hmm. So riffing off of that, there's a Talented 10th piece in concert with folks who are already doing this work, who've been doing this work in community. And so I always talk about in my work, ritual spaces, we can call them ciphers, we can call them jam sessions and jazz, we can call them sort of these spaces that are created where people are doing this work. And I think about the freedom schools during the 60s, et cetera, that there are farmers, people who are in the community who are already, who are farming, and they're being hit. I mean, this is one of the questions we were actually asking each other last year after the election. And one of the things that I was asking people in our community, how are we supporting and shoring up those folks who are actually going to really be hit by this? And there are people they're doulas, there are people who are doing all kinds of public health community work. But how are we connecting with one another in spaces? There's spaces that are owned by the community. That's one of the things. I went to Unbar Cafe, where we had all these different sessions around Ananse and Africana myth, et cetera. But how are we actually, those of us within these institutions, I mean, you've done it with the business, the Black Business Expo, how are we tapping into and connecting and providing spaces where we're doing this work with folks who are already doing this work in the community and making sure they're okay? I mean, people actually doing, I'm forgetting what they call it when you get money for people, something fund, what's the thing? Huh? No, the online thing, GoFundMe.
GoFundMe.
No, I'm saying, well,
I heard fun, but I couldn't hear the rest.
No, sorry. Well, there's a Black women's store in Atlanta, and they were having problems going out, and people, I don't know if they did a GoFundMe. I think they did an action where for like a week, they said, go in the store and shop. But how are we actually using social media? I mean, that's the other problem around this double consciousness. I mean, I've been seeing people on social media. How can we show up on social media with Meta and other kinds of things? Are we going to be targeted? So there are all kinds of ways in which people are trying to figure sort of this out in this new time and day. But how are we tapping into and collaborating with folks who are going to be hit by this, but who are also already doing this kind of work to make sure that people have access to food, to make sure that people are getting communication around healthcare, because we know they're going to be getting competing messages and wrong information. And if they get a check, how is that also, combined with, who we think has the authority and who we listen to, the person whose name is on the check. So.
Yeah. Use the mic.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and I think about the farm workers. Like, this is a big deal with planned deportations and stuff. Like, this is not, it is our communities, but it is the collective as well. And so thinking about what's happening.
And I think that's a relevant point. Is when we look around and what's happening is that very often people are not educated. I was having coffee a few minutes ago with someone, and we were having this conversation of people saying, I just can't listen anymore. I need to protect my space. But in disengaging, you don't know what's happening, and what's happening you need to be engaged with. And so I think when we talk about that, it is a broader audience. But I want to go to this thought for a minute, even thinking about that. When we think about access, when we think about thought, we think about knowledge. One of the things that has happened throughout the last couple of weeks, feels like it's been 5 years, but the last couple of weeks, is how much I've realized people don't know. Mm-hmm. And how much teaching I've had to do in the last couple of weeks. And so W.E.B. Du Bois says, the history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa. He would not bleach the Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that the Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. And so it's Black History Month. And we are coming to a close of Black History Month. And for those of you who want to run out of here and say that they gave us the shortest month, That is a myth. That is not why we have Black History Month. Remember, we attribute Black History Month to Carter G. Woodson. A teaching moment right now. We attribute Black History Month to Carter G. Woodson because Carter G. Woodson started Black History Week between two of his favorite people, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And so in that, we Black folk, I'm talking to the Black folk now, Black folk, when you run out of here, I don't want nobody else to say anymore that they gave us the shortest month. They didn't give us anything. Okay, so we're going to keep that in mind. But to my panelists.
The book is The Miseducation of the Negro, for those who need to read it.
Yes. So in this, let's talk about this particular aspect. So for America has too much to teach the world and Africa, or America has too much to teach the world in New Mexico. And so the Negro blood or the Chicana blood has a message for the world. Give me your thoughts.
Resilience, persistence, faith, belief, endurance, and an unquenchable desire for betterment is the blood, the Negro blood, I believe, would be the words that I would put there. For America, I would say innovation. I'd give it that. Stick-to-itiveness. But I'd also use words like imperialism, supremacy. I'm better than you because of my hue. A history of, as Ice Cube said, that's bloody, that has centuries and centuries of blood on his hands. Let's be honest. So when I think of those words by Du Bois in today's context, yes, the two have to mix. There is good, there is bad, but maybe the cycle now that this ugliness that is coming out that we see, or I'll say I see, has to be addressed. Because to continue to keep and push down marginalized groups because feelings are hurt. And those were the words that I think the former governor of Florida said when he started a lot of the anti-wokeness. Someone's feelings hurt, but what about the lives that were lost? What about the lands that were taken? What about in the Lift Every Voice and Sing, there's a verses that talks about the hopes that died unborn. Those are the things that course through my consciousness, my veins, because I have an obligation to take the advantages and the privileges of my education, the belief in my ancestors, my grandparents, that would say you can be anything that you wanted to. My identity is also shaped by this. Last house on the left of a dead-end street. That's my identity. Because another Richard Pryor said, you can shoot me a mic because I've only got to go up. And that's how I view the world. That in this America, that blood, it has to be up. We have a responsibility. We have to resist. We have to take on that mantle and that strength that he talks about that is inherent in all of us. We have to put it forth. You're right, Heather. We can no longer be disengaged. We have to say something, do something, because it ain't right.
I cannot address those two questions separately. I think what America has to teach the world is rooted in Black struggle for freedom and all that follows with that. I think the notion of freedom is incomplete with the 4th of July and begins to be expanded with Juneteenth. That it is the Black struggle for freedom and the way in which that struggle connected with Chicano, Asian, all the other Jewish, all the other communities that became a part of that struggle, and calling the United States to be true to its own definition. Well, let me back that up. I'm not sure if that's its own definition, but this using this word freedom, which for too many, and we now see that that's come back around, cycle back around, really just meant white male, property white men's freedom. I mean, that's, and so what the United States has really had to offer the world has been the struggle of marginalized folks to come to the center of that promise of freedom, and what it has meant for us to then begin to reconstruct and think about in terms of our laws and our ethical comportment in terms of what does that mean for us to be together. So that's why it's so significant at this point in time, where things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and wokeness are now, even though the laws haven't fundamentally changed,
Right.
but are now being, the language around them is they're illegal, they're destroying us, et cetera. And now we see that Europe, Canada, North, South, and Central America, other places, are now saying we can no longer understanding that we can no longer look to the United States. And so for me, what our ancestors did through the Civil Rights Movement was, and Voting Rights Act and 13, 14, 15, all those amendments, et cetera, were moving us toward a more expansive, inclusive, and true understanding of freedom. And so the notion now that we're pushing back on from the institution of higher education, and people are giving into that, the notion of controversial, and I've dealt with colleagues who've used that word controversial. And in academy, that means it's rooted in data and research and qualitative and like it's rooted in something. And now controversial is just something that makes me feel bad. And it becomes controversial, which, and that we're accepting those kinds of definitions in our general discussion and language is utterly problematic. So for me, it continues to be how Black people, Africana communities continue to stand in who we are and who we have been and what we have been calling this nation to be, and how we are actually working with folks who are allies. And we're finding out now who people are, and where they stand, and the kind of courage they have, and whether or not they're going to use their social capital to actually fight for freedom and inclusivity for all.
And as we, I'm going to pose one more question that I just want like a 10-second answer to. But as they're doing that, if you have questions, we're going to be opening it up to audience questions. So we will have a few minutes for Q&A. And so if you do have questions, I do ask that you line up at the 2 microphones that are on each side of the room. We have one this side and one on that side. And so, Maria, if you want to.
So I want to take this time to wish all the friends and family of African Black descent who have been a part of my life, who have helped to shape me in the world and how in my worldview. I think that has been something, those relationships have been so meaningful and so powerful in thinking about how we stand together in doing this work. And so that is my gratitude today and always.
Yeah, thank you. And so in that, I'm looking for questions from the audience. Please don't hesitate. So 10-second response. What are some steps that you have taken to take care of self in this battle of double consciousness?
Hanging out with good friends, being around good people, having conversations that are engaged, that are talking about how we continue to move forward with that resilience and that persistence and the joy through faith. That's for me the biggest number one.
Rebuilding, rediscovering my spiritual side, my faith, connecting with good people, and doing a lot of reading, just reading and saying, okay, how do we get out of this, and trying to find an answer.
Dancing, cooking and eating good food, reading. But yes, I'm actually going to be going to the Society for Study of Black Religion in Montgomery, Alabama, with my cousin aunt who actually marched in 1963 from Montgomery to Selma. And I talk to Jackie, who's my grandfather's cousin, my father's age, often. So it's being connected to family and people in the community that can sustain us, but also with whom I can collaborate to keep moving forward.
Yeah, I love that, and we have to think about that, especially during this time period in this society. I thought I was having a conversation. I got a text message from a family member of highlighting my great aunt who did work throughout her lifetime, and we're talking about somebody who now would have been in her 90s, and she was one of the first people to be a professor of Black Studies in Pennsylvania. At Millersville University, at Millersville University, and South Carolina State was highlighting her. And I said, I wish I could talk to her right now and ask, what did you do then that we need to be doing right now, because it's the same fight? And so I was telling my family, I said, can we raise Aunt Hazel from the dead so I can ask her some questions? Impossible, but all I kept looking at this article and looking at what she fought for and what she was dealing with during that time, and saying this is the exact same fight and the exact same thing. And so we do have to take care of ourselves. We'll go over here first.
Thank you. So first, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom and your knowledge. It's given me a lot to think about in my own Americanness. I have, in the year that was January, been seeing a lot of discourse about that same fight, right? And do you, as folks who you know the American dream is not built for, do you continue to fight that same fight? Do you stay on that side of the rock, or do you choose the hard place of forgoing your Americanness and leaving and trying to find your place somewhere else? So what are your thoughts about that?
In November, I turned 60, and as a treat to myself, I took a trip to Portugal. And so there were many, many conversations. And the reason why I went to Portugal, Lisbon, because there's a large African-American and African diasporic community there. And so there's lots of discussion regarding people relocating, and people were relocating as we were speaking. And so that's a choice for people. We were talking about Baldwin and W. Du Bois, who immigrated to Ghana, and so those are questions. And we know there are a lot of people, particularly African American, and particularly 92% Black women, who are like, I'm gonna stay right here for right now as I move forward. And oh gosh, I'm forgetting the author's name. Alice Walker talks about this in the definition of womanism, is that I'm not a separatist except for health. So I think for me, I'm not trying to tell anybody to do what I'm doing. I think people have to do what they need to do, because there's a short term, but we also have to make it through a long term. There's a longer arc of this. And so people need to work where and when as they can, but you need to be able to sustain yourself through all of this. And so sustaining oneself is important within community. But I think people have to make choices about how to best do that. But I think the option isn't to disengage, because wherever we go, we will all be affected and impacted by this. So disengagement is not going to save us or anyone else. But we have to figure out where we can be, how we can do our work and what we need to rest and restore as we're doing it.
So to make sure that we can get an answer from each question, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, if you don't have a passport, please make sure you go to your library or post office and get a passport.
So we'll go to this side of the room.
Hello, thank you very much for the conversation today. My name is Isaac Anaya, and my identities as a Clevelander, as a Mexican Puerto Rican, as a Latino man. I had two particular thoughts that came as I was listening to the discussion, and the first one regarding Dr. Burton had mentioned of being Africana blood and being in in America, and there's this author that my professor had once mentioned. Her name was Gloria Anzaldúa, and she talks about the border las fronteras, which is a mestiza consciousness of like not being from here and not being from there either, and it's a mixed consciousness essentially. That was the whole conversation, and that's what I got out of this, and it reminded me of that. And then in particularly talking about like the United States and America and its like goal or ambitions, and I'm kind of worried about like the co-option that it has for our identities to like do that, and I'm concerned of like the harm that it has, and particularly we try to survive, but I feel like essentially it's trying to thrive off of what we have culturally enriched in our identities. So what would you say to that as terms to like, you know, the overall concern that we try to navigate this space? I mean, we take it day by day, hour by hour, but I appreciate the conversation if there's no thoughts on it, of course, but thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say ni de aquí, ni de allá, right? That's like I'm not from here or from there. I would really love to hear your perspectives on this as well. Coming from what you were saying, I think that is, you know, when you asked us about what we envision and how I kept on seeing like, gosh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just be proud in our culture and like show it and keep flaunting it and like just not letting that go away. You know, I think that when we get like, is it whitewashed? Is it American washed? Like, what is the washing that happens, right? And so it's like, how do we keep up our traditions and kind of that from that heritage? And so that's something that, to your statement, is something that I think about a lot. But I'd also love to hear.
I believe that it will be a constant struggle to bring the multiple sides together within our own selves as well as our society. We see the supposed opulence of the American dream and what it brings, yet you can walk across the street in some areas and you can see the destitution, you can see the poverty, you can see basically, I don't care about this person because they are a different other, but aren't they American as well? I believe we will have this struggle for the rest of this society's lifespan until we really address the historical violence that has occurred. Let's step back from, say, Africans. Let's talk about the violence to the indigenous people who were here. We were all fed this line in grade school. Columbus discovered America. The Mayflower came here. Wait a minute, there were people here, but we don't talk about that. So that technology of education, we have to address that. That gets at the root. If we want to root out some of this madness, I believe the education that is going on. This dual consciousness, triple, quadruple consciousness, it's a day-to-day fight. As Joy said, she looked at that. For me, I'm looking at leaving. Du Bois left. Baldwin left. Marvin Gaye left. You know, left for a period of time because I'm saying, wait a minute. This Constitution says we are all equal. We should all have this. We should all have that. But it's not. It's not played out that way. And yes, I can engage from Namibia or Botswana. There are places in this world when I travel, I feel more comfortable outside of the United States than I do inside the United States in many occasions. Because yeah, I'm Dr. Miller on this campus, but let someone stop me. I'm just another somebody with a nice car and better not say the wrong word. Being a Southerner, you learn very early the talk. So that whole issue about being from here and what it means, it's a daily struggle.
Yeah, agreed. I want to make sure we get, because we're at our time, but I want to make sure we get our last two questions. And really quick, I will add, it's interesting when you say, when you go out from this campus, you're just another. And I remember I got pulled over, and the first thing that the officer said to me was, "Is this your car?" I was like, I've never gotten pulled over and someone asked me, "Is this your car?" You didn't ask for license, registration. You just say, "Is this your car?" And I started to say, "What, you think I can't drive this?" But then I said, remember, remember the rules that you've learned about dealing with police. Sharice?
Hello, I'm Sharice Lucas, and I'm also the president of Cruise Black Student Union. I just really want to know how you guys think students should respond to universities when they begin to comply with Trump administration's orders of reshaping or really dismantling DEI targeted initiatives, because like we were discussing earlier, W.E.B. Du Bois does kind of commend people who go to university because we are that talented 10th, and it does grant me privilege being here, but how should I respond when they're, I guess, responding against me?
I'm gonna.
Oh, we host the Black graduation, so they can't take that.
So I'm gonna double back on your point, and I don't know, for some reason I'm quoting Kendrick Lamar. Sometimes you just got to pop out and show people, right? To your point about being bold in who you are, and now we do have to, like Samuel L. Jackson, we have to think about when and where we do that, because there's always a cost when you pop out. But there are safe spaces where we can do that. We all have to exercise who we are, and there's safe spaces where we can do that. We may be in spaces where, if we're talking different languages or our hair is different, like people have something to say, and there's a breathing technique or some other kind of technique you have to leave that where it is so you can move on. The problem is when we accumulate that and take that with us. In terms of your question, is work with faculty and staff and about how to do it. Again, whatever we do, there may be pushback or consequence. But I definitely think that if we are going to move forward and maintain and create spaces, not only for yourselves, but the people who come behind, because people have done that before you came here in terms of, in our alum as well. We've been talking about this. There are alum who want to connect with African-American alum who want to connect with students, et cetera, and think about how we support one another so that we know what each other is doing. And that way we can have a plan ahead of time and strategize. But I think definitely what's happening right now is voluntary. And so as long as no one says anything or pushes back, people will do what they're going to do. And so what we're doing, I know on the faculty and administrative side for Black folks, is we're talking about all the contributions we've made to this institution, all the service that we've given to this institution, all the ways in which we've made a way for changes and for things to actually happen, all the search committees we've served on for departments, all the ways in which we've served on higher level searches, all the ways in which our labor, we have on Africana Studies, we have 3 faculty on our leadership team of 5 who have major Mellon grants. And so we need for people to know that we bring, and they're all based in Africana Studies and related to Africana Studies. So when you come to me and you say the medical school and engineering, it's like, no, we're actually bringing in dollars and administrative dollars here too. Because people know and understand. We had a college faculty meeting and someone said to us, like, when we presented for Africana Studies department, and someone said, that was the best meeting we ever had. So because we're using Africana Studies methodology, which is both and, which is reciprocity. It's not zero-sum game. It's about community and who we are together and what we ought to be. And so for you as students, I think that, again, being true to yourselves and not self-censoring yourselves, but also being strategic about how that works, about how that happens, but having everybody with you. So that means that we are all talking with each other and communicating, say, oh, this is what you're going to do? Well, this may be our advice. You do, we're not going to try to take over, but if we know, then we can actually work, we can work in other kinds of ways because we're in rooms, et cetera, to make sure that you're covering that space. But I think being engaged is important, not feeling powerless, because all of us, no matter how marginalized or what place we're in, we all have power to choose how we respond and what we do in the moment. And I think that becomes important to decide how we can respond and what we can do and how we marshal our resources together to make a difference.
And I'm going to add this, is that it's important right now as an institution, as individuals that are a part of the institution, to know what's coming from administration and what's coming from fear. So a lot of things that are happening on campus right now are from individuals being afraid versus what administration is telling them to do. And so no one has shut down the diversity, equity, and inclusion across this campus from an administration level, except for one or two things. And that has nothing to do with students, but from the fear of the executive orders and the fear of Senate Bill 1 and the fear of the Dear Colleague letter has caused people within departments and with areas to move and begin to strip and take away things that are not the directives of others. And so it's really important to know that. And I go back and also knowing, and this is when we go back to this engagement, is that as university people, whether you're faculty, staff, student, postdoc, we have a responsibility to be engaged and know what really is from administration and what's really hearsay.
But Heather, they are cataloging. Aren't they cataloging all stuff that has anything to do with DEI?
They may be cataloging, but nothing has been stripped. So it's a difference between cataloging to get ahead of stuff. I haven't even heard the catalog. And VP Solomon's saying the same thing. So we haven't heard this. Now, people in your areas may be cataloging. And this is what I mean, is that folks are running in fear. And I have had many faculty to come to me, but in terms of what we heard from and we're the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion office. So I would figure if we were cataloging diversity, equity, and inclusion, this office would know. So, and that's all that I'm saying is that this office would know because we would be supporting the cataloging. Now, let me clarify. There was an incident in terms of someone writing something in an op-ed that raised some concern and confusion and then started asking questions for people to show what they were doing as it related to DEI hiring. Now, that may be the cataloging that you're speaking of, but in terms of university cataloging, because here's the thing that we have to look at, is that there are so many aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion on our campus. Greek Life, everyone that's a part of Greek Life, all of their organizations have a diversity, equity, and inclusion. There is diversity, equity, and inclusion people in all of the schools. There are committees. And so if there was going to be a move from administration, it would be a much larger push in terms of what was being said, because that means we've got a whole lot to shut down beyond the sidebar conversations that are happening based on fear. And so I just want to make sure that we are informed and aware and not jumping on the bandwagon. And being administration, and that's the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion, I think if there was some things, and we know we are privy to some information, not even saying that we're not privy to some information, but some of the things that I've heard that have been occurring on campus is not coming from us.
That's why.
Yeah.
So you know what's going on.
Definitely.
Y'all need to be saying, trustee, president, this stuff matters. This improves our outcomes. This makes a
Cassie, you can't be hijacking my program today. I need to get this question though. From anyone. And let's not just put the burden on the students. This is for anyone. Everyone has a responsibility and an obligation, and it's just not students. If you are faculty and staff on this campus, you should be supporting the students, but we also have an obligation. We're going to take our last question so we can shut this down for today.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate all of you sharing your stories and your wisdom. My name is Yvette Noriega. I'm fronteriza from the U.S.-Mexican border, and I'm also a senior research associate at the Begun Center and a part-time MBA student at Weatherhead. So we know that money talks, and I just wanted to ask you, what is your favorite locally owned small business that you think we should put our hard-earned dollars in?
Go to Maze. I say it's Maze. It's falafel cafe, which is kind of off in the cut behind. You walk through the breezeway and you turn left. It's left of Mitchell's Ice Cream, the Mediterranean. Go to May's place, best hummus, swarm. She's great. Tell her David sent you, okay? Please, so you know. But May's, falafel cafe.
Bar Cafe on Larchmere. They actually are dedicated space of community work. So if you have a meeting, go by there and get your donuts or go by and get your muffins, coffee, tea, etc. They have wine selection, and they also have salads and po' boys, etc., etc. But especially if you're doing meetings, just go by there and get what you need for breakfast for your staff, etc. But that's a good place.
Bar Cafe.
There's a place called Market Wine, and it's downtown, I think in Ohio City, and that is run by Elizabeth and her sister, and they are alums of CASE too, so that's a nice little wine bar. And then there's Centro Via, which is a new community area for all people, Latinos focused. I don't know if you've been there, Yvette, yet. There's tons of activities going on there too, and so a great place to commute.
Yeah. And what's the other place we just ordered from?
Oh, yeah, Young Village. Started actually for our lunchbox kind of study.
Yeah.
But Young Village.
And one of my favorites is Taste of Jamaica on Mayfield. So Taste of Jamaica, and depending on what mood I'm in, I will drive anywhere to find food and eat. But Taste of Jamaica. Thank you for that question. That was a great question. And follow, stay engaged. Not only stay engaged within the campus community, but stay engaged within society as a whole, because what happens within society impacts us within the campus. And so I'm going to turn things back over to VP Solomon, and I want to say thank you to our panelists. You were great. And thank you to the panelists for shifting with me, because I don't think I asked but 2 questions that were actually on the paper that I gave them. So I thank the panelists for shifting gears.
Yes. I join Dr. Burton in thanking our panel for sharing their time and their perspectives. We greatly appreciate it. We want you to also continue to reflect. We have, if you use the QR code, we want you to take a moment to fill out the short evaluation that's on the screen so that we can make assessments on how we proceed and what's useful and helpful. And then we want to see you at our next program, which will be here on Friday, March 21st. We will host author Victoria Christopher Murray, author of the newly released book, Harlem Rhapsody. And we look forward to seeing you here at that time. So thank you all for coming out. Let's complete the survey, talk amongst yourselves. You have something to add?
Yes, I do. I have one request. And so you'll see here that we have the CWRU Spring Gospel Concert. We are still looking for singers. This is a gospel concert that will be a combination of faculty, staff, students, and alum. And so if you can sing, I know many of us think that we can sing, but this is really, if you can sing, we are asking you to please be a part of this. This is actually, as we talk about being proactive, This is one of the first initiatives to create an endowment for our Envision Weekend program. And so this is our first fundraising push that we are pushing forward. And so again, please either see myself, Evelyn, we'll take your information if you are interested in singing in the gospel choir. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Take some leftover food.